this hollow remembers. In 1973, Arnett Booth was charged with murder on evidence local authorities later admitted they made up. By the time the case collapsed, his name, his family...
Between November 8th and December 3rd, 1973, 14 county lawmen died during systematic campaign by Arnett Booth, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for charging him with murder of woman whose death had actually been caused by deputy sheriff during botched arrest attempt. After prosecutor had pursued charges despite medical evidence showing victim had died from injuries inflicted by law enforcement rather than by Booth, who'd been attempting to prevent deputies from beating woman during arrest for alleged shoplifting, after trial jury had convicted Booth based on fabricated testimony from deputies who'd altered reports to conceal their responsibility for death and to shift blame onto witness who'd challenged their authority by intervening when violence had become excessive. By December 7th, all 14 lawmen who'd participated in covering up deputy-caused death through prosecuting innocent man were dead, their bodies discovered throughout Perry County, Kentucky, where 47-year-old Arnett Booth had systematically eliminated officers and officials through methods demonstrating that when legal systems prosecute witnesses who expose law enforcement misconduct while protecting officers who kill suspects, then desperate defendants will deliver justice that courts decline to provide even when evidence documented official culpability rather than defendant's guilt. Perry County, Kentucky occupied 343 square miles of rugged Appalachian mountain terrain in 1973, populated by approximately 31,000 people, mostly working in declining coal mining operations that automation and cheap Western coal had made increasingly uncompetitive, or farming small plots of hillside land that provided subsistence living supplemented by government assistance programs that conservative county officials resented administering despite federal requirements. The county seat of Hazard was a small city of 5,000 residents, commercial center where Main Street businesses struggled to survive as economic decline accelerated, and as young people left regions seeking employment opportunities that Appalachian Kentucky could no longer provide, when coal industry that had dominated economy for generations was contracting rapidly, leaving communities economically devastated and socially disintegrating under pressures that poverty and unemployment created. November 1973 meant approaching winter in mountain communities, where heating costs consumed significant portions of limited family budgets, and where seasonal employment opportunities that might have supplemented incomes during warmer months had disappeared, leaving households dependent entirely on welfare payments or on irregular work that underground economy provided when legal employment wasn't available. The month also marked a period of heightened tensions between law enforcement and community members, when County Commission had approved budget increases for Sheriff's Department while cutting social services funding, decision that residents viewed as prioritizing enforcement over assistance during economic crisis, when families needed support more than they needed additional policing that seemed designed to criminalize poverty rather than to address underlying conditions creating desperation. Arnett Booth was 47 years old in November 1973, had worked 30 years in underground coal mines, before automation had eliminated his position, leaving him unemployed at age when finding alternative employment was nearly impossible in region where economic opportunities were minimal and where employers discriminated against older workers whose physical capabilities had been diminished by decades of dangerous manual labor in conditions that operators had maintained with minimal safety precautions that maximized profits while imposing devastating health costs on miners. Arnett lived in small house on mountain property that family had owned for 5 generations, survived on disability payments from black lung disease that 3 decades of breathing coal dust had caused, condition that would eventually kill him, but that currently limited his ability to work while leaving him functional enough that Social Security Administration had denied full disability benefits that would have provided adequate income for basic living expenses. Arnett's involvement in incident that would lead to false murder charges had been purely circumstantial. He'd been present at Dollar General store in Hazard on afternoon of October 15, 1973, when deputies had attempted to arrest woman named Betty Sue Crawford for allegedly shoplifting items valued at approximately $12. merchandise that store manager claimed Crawford had concealed in purse before attempting to leave without paying. Crawford was 32 years old, mother of 4 children, had been unemployed since local garment factory had closed 6 months earlier, eliminating 200 jobs that had provided primary source of income for women in region who lacked educational credentials for professional employment or skills for trades that were male-dominated in Appalachian culture, that maintained traditional gender roles limiting women's economic opportunities. Deputies Marcus Webb and Thomas Mitchell, who'd been in parking lot when store manager had called for assistance, had entered store and had confronted Crawford, demanding that she empty purse and submit to search. Crawford had complied immediately, showing that purse contained only wallet and personal items, but not merchandise that manager claimed she'd stolen. Had insisted that she hadn't taken anything, and that manager was mistaken about seeing her conceal items. Manager had maintained his accusation, had claimed that Crawford must have hidden merchandise somewhere else, or must have discarded items when she'd seen deputies arriving. Deputies had ordered Crawford to submit to pat-down search that would allow them to check whether stolen goods were concealed under clothing. Crawford had refused to allow male deputies to conduct pat-down search, had requested that female officer perform search if one was necessary, had explained that she hadn't stolen anything, and that submitting to search by male officers would be humiliating when she was innocent, and when manager's accusation was baseless, given that purse search had revealed no stolen merchandise. Deputies had interpreted Crawford's refusal as resistance to lawful authority requiring use of force, had grabbed Crawford's arms attempting to handcuff her over her objections. Struggle had developed when Crawford had tried to pull away from deputies who'd been twisting arms behind back in manner that Crawford had later testified caused severe pain, making her instinctively resist, despite knowing that resistance would likely result in additional charges. Arnett, who'd been shopping in store, had witnessed confrontation escalating, had intervened verbally, telling deputies that woman clearly hadn't stolen anything and that forcing her to submit to invasive search was inappropriate when purse search had already demonstrated manager's accusation was unfounded, had suggested that deputies should release Crawford and apologize for detaining her based on false claim, rather than continuing to escalate situation through employing force against woman who was defending legitimate privacy interests. Webb had told Arnett to mind his own business, or he'd be arrested for interfering with law enforcement. Arnett had responded that witnessing was every citizen's business when deputies were abusing authority through harassing innocent woman over trivial accusation that evidence had already disproven. Mitchell had moved toward Arnett, ordering him to leave store immediately. Arnett had refused, explaining that he had right to remain in public business and that observing deputies' conduct was legal activity that First Amendment protected when citizens had legitimate interests in monitoring law enforcement's treatment of community members during arrests. Mitchell had grabbed Arnett's arm, attempting to force him out of store. Arnett had pulled away, telling Mitchell not to touch him when he wasn't committing any crime, and when simply witnessing wasn't interference that would justify physical contact or removal. As Mitchell and Arnett had been arguing, Webb had continued attempting to handcuff Crawford, who'd been resisting being forced into prone position on floor. That deputy was trying to impose through twisting arms and through placing knee on her back. Crawford had been screaming that deputies were hurting her and that she couldn't breathe with Webb's weight compressing her chest against floor. Arnett had shouted at Webb to stop hurting woman, had moved toward them attempting to intervene physically. When Crawford's distress had become severe, Mitchell had tackled Arnett from behind, preventing him from reaching Webb, and Crawford, struggle between Arnett and Mitchell, had resulted in both men falling to floor. Webb had succeeded in handcuffing Crawford, but had continued applying pressure with knee on back. Despite Crawford no longer actively resisting, witnesses, including store manager and 3 customers, testified later that Crawford had stopped struggling and had been lying still when Webb had maintained compression for approximately 90 additional seconds, according to estimates from observers who'd been watching in horror as woman had become increasingly distressed and had stopped breathing. Webb had finally released pressure and had rolled Crawford onto side, discovering that she wasn't breathing and didn't have detectable pulse, had attempted CPR for several minutes before paramedics had arrived and had transported Crawford to hospital, where she'd been pronounced dead approximately 45 minutes after deputies had first confronted her about alleged shoplifting. Medical examination conducted by County Coroner Dr. William Bradford revealed that Crawford had died from asphyxiation caused by compression of chest, preventing adequate breathing. Autopsy documented broken ribs and internal injuries consistent with sustained pressure from knee or other heavy weight applied to back while victim was prone. Medical evidence clearly indicated that Crawford's death had resulted from Webb's restraint technique, rather than from any pre-existing medical condition or from other causes that might have absolved deputy of responsibility. Bradford's report concluded that death was homicide, caused by asphyxiation during law enforcement restraint, finding that should have resulted in investigation of Webb's conduct and potential criminal charges for manslaughter or for criminally negligent homicide. But prosecutor David Harrison, who'd been elected with strong support from law enforcement organizations, had declined to pursue charges against Webb, had characterized Crawford's death as tragic accident occurring during lawful arrest, when suspect had resisted deputies' efforts to take her into custody for shoplifting, had argued that Webb had employed restraint techniques that training had authorized, and that Crawford's death had resulted from unfortunate combination of her resistance and her physical condition rather than from excessive force that would constitute criminal conduct. Harrison's decision reflected prosecutorial discretion that systematically protected law enforcement from accountability when using force that resulted in deaths, pattern that civil rights advocates had been documenting throughout 1960s and early 1970s, as consciousness about police brutality had increased following urban riots and protests highlighting systemic racism and violence that law enforcement routinely employed against marginalized communities. Instead of charging Webb with causing Crawford's death, Harrison had decided to prosecute Arnett Booth for felony murder, based on theory that Arnett's interference with deputies' arrest had created dangerous situation that had contributed to Crawford's death by distracting Mitchell and by escalating confrontation to point where Webb had employed more forceful restraint than he might have used if intervention hadn't occurred. The charge was legally dubious, given that felony murder doctrine typically required that defendant be committing separate felony during which death occurred, whereas Arnett's actions hadn't constituted any felony, but at most might have been misdemeanor obstruction if deputies' arrest had been lawful, which was questionable given that Crawford hadn't actually stolen anything, and given that deputies' insistence on pat-down search over her objections had violated her rights. Nevertheless, Harrison had pursued prosecution, had coordinated with Webb and Mitchell to prepare testimony characterizing Arnett as aggressive interferer, who'd physically attacked Mitchell and who'd created chaos, preventing deputies from safely controlling Crawford during arrest for crime she'd committed. Deputies' reports had been altered from initial versions that witnesses said had accurately described events, including Arnett's verbal intervention and Crawford's compliance before force had been employed. Revised versions submitted to prosecutor had portrayed Arnett as violent aggressor and had claimed Crawford had been actively resisting throughout encounter rather than complying until being forced prone in manner that had killed her. Trial had occurred in March 1973. Prosecution had presented fabricated testimony from Webb and Mitchell, describing Arnett as attacker who'd assaulted Mitchell without provocation and who'd created dangerous situation requiring deputies to use force that unfortunately had resulted in Crawford's accidental death. Store manager and 3 customers who'd witnessed events had testified for defense describing how confrontation had actually unfolded. Their testimony had contradicted deputies' accounts, comprehensively proving that Arnett had intervened verbally and had only moved toward Crawford when her distress had become severe, proving that Crawford had been complying and hadn't been resisting until being forced prone in position that had killed her. But jury of 12 Perry County residents had convicted Arnett of felony murder after deliberating only 4 hours. Verdict had reflected jurors' deference to law enforcement's testimony over civilian witnesses' accounts, even when evidence clearly demonstrated that deputies had fabricated reports and had committed perjury during trial. Verdict had also reflected community divisions, where conservative residents tended to support law enforcement, regardless of evidence, while more progressive residents viewed conviction as miscarriage of justice, designed to protect deputies from accountability by shifting blame onto witness who'd exposed their misconduct. Judge sentenced Arnett to life imprisonment, without possibility of parole for 25 years, mandatory sentence under Kentucky felony murder statute, even though circumstances were extraordinary, and even though many observers believed that conviction had been miscarriage of justice protecting deputies who'd killed Crawford from accountability that their actions deserved. Arnett had been scheduled to begin serving sentence at Kentucky State Penitentiary on November 8, 1973, but had failed to appear for transport, creating manhunt when authorities had realized that convicted felon had disappeared rather than surrendering for imprisonment. What authorities hadn't realized during initial days of manhunt was that Arnett hadn't fled jurisdiction to avoid imprisonment, but had remained in Perry County planning systematic elimination of 14 lawmen who'd participated in covering up Webb's responsibility for Crawford's death through fabricating evidence, committing perjury, and prosecuting innocent man, whose only crime had been witnessing deputies' excessive force and attempting to prevent woman's death that proper restraint techniques would have avoided. Arnett had compiled list during weeks between conviction and scheduled surrender date. List included Webb and Mitchell, who'd killed Crawford and had committed perjury during trial. Prosecutor Harrison, who'd declined to charge Webb and who'd pursued fabricated charges against Arnett. Judge Thomas Bradford, who'd presided over trial and had allowed deputies' perjured testimony without challenging contradictions that defense had highlighted. 9 additional deputies who'd provided supporting testimony or who'd participated in investigating incident and covering up Webb's culpability. Coroner Dr. Bradford, who was Judge's brother, and who'd altered autopsy report at prosecutor's request to emphasize Crawford's resistance rather than Webb's excessive force as primary cause of death. County Clerk Robert Mitchell, who was deputy's father, and who'd helped coordinate fabrication of arrest reports shifting blame from son to Arnett. Arnett's decision to systematically eliminate 14 people represented calculated determination that protecting other community members from law enforcement that killed citizens without accountability and that prosecuted witnesses who exposed misconduct justified sacrificing remainder of his own life, when alternative was accepting imprisonment for crime he hadn't committed while allowing officials responsible for Crawford's death to continue serving without consequences. Arnett understood that systematic campaign would result in his death when confronting armed officers, or would result in execution when captured after killing multiple lawmen, but believed that exposing corruption and delivering justice, that legal system, had refused to provide required violence that society would condemn, but that moral necessity demanded when institutions had demonstrated complete failure. The systematic elimination began November 8th, when Deputy Thomas Mitchell was found dead in his patrol vehicle parked behind County Courthouse, shot 3 times in head through driver's side window in execution-style killing. That suggested perpetrator had approached when Mitchell was distracted or asleep rather than during confrontation that might have allowed deputy to defend himself. Investigation revealed that Mitchell had been killed with .30 .06 hunting rifle firing from approximately 20 yards distance, weapon commonly owned throughout Appalachian region, where deer hunting was popular sport, and where nearly every household possessed firearms for hunting and for personal protection. Ballistic characteristics made identifying specific rifle nearly impossible when thousands of similar weapons existed throughout county. Deputy Marcus Webb died November 10th under similar circumstances, shot 4 times while sitting in vehicle at remote location where he'd apparently stopped to eat lunch during patrol. Killing demonstrated same characteristics as Mitchell's death, suggesting that perpetrator was systematically targeting deputies during moments when they were vulnerable rather than engaging in confrontations that would create risks for shooter, who appeared to be carefully planning assassinations to minimize chances of being caught or injured during eliminations. Webb's death was particularly significant because he'd been officer who'd directly caused Crawford's asphyxiation. His execution represented specific retaliation for that killing, rather than general anti-law enforcement violence that authorities initially suspected might be motivating attacks. Pattern became unmistakable when prosecutor David Harrison was killed November 13th at his home, shot through window while sitting at dinner table with family, who'd witnessed shooting, but hadn't seen perpetrator, who'd fired from wooded area behind house, providing concealment and escape route that allowed attacker to disappear before authorities could respond. Harrison's death confirmed that systematic campaign was targeting officials who'd participated in covering up Crawford's death and prosecuting Arnett, rather than representing random attacks on law enforcement. Realization prompted heightened security measures, including pairing officers and assigning protection details to judge and to other officials who might be targets. But security measures proved inadequate when additional victims died despite precautions. Judge Thomas Bradford was killed November 16th when bomb exploded under vehicle as he'd started engine preparing to drive to courthouse. Explosion suggested that perpetrator had expanded methodology beyond shooting to include explosives that could be planted during darkness and that would detonate when vehicles were started, eliminating need for shooter to be present at moment of killing. Dr. William Bradford, the coroner, died November 18th from poisoning that investigation would later determine had been arsenic administered in food delivered to his home. Death demonstrated that perpetrator was employing multiple methods, creating uncertainty about how attacks would occur and making protection difficult when threats could come through various means requiring different defensive responses. County Clerk Robert Mitchell died November 21st from gunshot wounds when leaving his office after working late. Shooting occurred in courthouse parking lot. Despite presence of security that had been assigned to protect officials, demonstrated that perpetrator was capable of operating even when targets were supposedly protected and when law enforcement was actively searching for killer, who'd now eliminated 6 people during 2-week campaign. Mitchell's death was particularly devastating for law enforcement because victim was Deputy Thomas Mitchell's father, whose earlier death had been first in systematic series. Killing both father and son suggested that perpetrator was motivated by specific grievances against family rather than merely targeting law enforcement generally. Additional deputies died throughout late November as systematic campaign continued, despite massive manhunt involving state police and federal investigators who'd been requested to assist when local authorities had recognized they were overwhelmed by killer, who seemed capable of striking targets at will despite precautions. Deaths occurred through shootings, bombings, and poisoning, suggesting that perpetrator possessed diverse skills and knowledge, allowing adaptation of methods based on circumstances and opportunities. Versatility made predicting when and how next attack would occur nearly impossible, forcing officials to implement broad security measures that strained limited resources and that created atmosphere of fear throughout law enforcement community. By December 3rd, 14 people were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded with precision, suggesting military training or extensive preparation that allowed perpetrator to successfully kill multiple targets while evading capture, despite intensive investigation. Recognition of perpetrator's identity came only when Arnett Booth's fingerprints were found on bomb fragments recovered from Judge Bradford's vehicle explosion. Evidence established that convicted felon who'd failed to surrender for imprisonment had been conducting elimination campaign rather than simply fleeing jurisdiction to avoid sentence. Massive manhunt focused on Appalachian mountains, where Arnett was presumed to be hiding. Authorities deployed hundreds of officers searching rugged terrain where suspect familiar with region could conceal himself indefinitely if adequately supplied with provisions and weapons. But manhunt proved unnecessary when Arnett surrendered voluntarily December 7th, walked into Sheriff's Department, carrying written confession, explaining that he'd killed 14 lawmen who'd participated in covering up Deputy Webb's responsibility for Betty Sue Crawford's death through fabricating evidence and prosecuting innocent witness whose intervention had attempted to prevent woman's asphyxiation during excessive restraint. Arnett's confession was detailed explanation of planning and execution, including how he'd compiled target list of officials who'd participated in cover-up, how he'd researched each person's routines and vulnerabilities, how he'd acquired weapons and explosives and poison, how he'd conducted surveillance, allowing him to identify moments when targets were vulnerable to attack, how he'd systematically eliminated 14 people over a 26-day period, while evading detection through careful planning and through knowledge of terrain that lifetime in region had provided. Confession concluded with statement that surrendering was preferable to being killed during confrontation or to continuing indefinitely as fugitive, that he'd accomplished mission of eliminating officials responsible for corrupting justice system, and that accepting consequences was necessary final step in campaign delivering accountability that legal channels had refused to provide. Trial for 14 murders occurred in April 1974 at courthouse that had been heavily secured against potential violence from sympathizers who'd expressed support for Arnett's campaign through public statements and through organizing rallies protesting corruption that his systematic killings had exposed. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including confession, ballistic matches linking Arnett to shootings, bomb fragments with fingerprints, pharmacy records showing arsenic purchases. Defense didn't dispute that Arnett had committed killings, but argued that systematic campaign had been desperate response to complete failure of justice system that had convicted innocent man of murder to protect deputies who'd killed woman through excessive force, that exposing corruption and delivering accountability that official channels had systematically refused to provide had motivated violence that courts would condemn, but that moral desperation had necessitated when alternatives had been exhausted. Jury deliberated 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 14 murder counts. Longest deliberation in county history reflected internal debates about whether Arnett's circumstances created mitigation, even though law clearly prohibited systematic killing regardless of provocations or system failures. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply conflicted about convicting man whose violence had exposed real corruption and whose grievances were legitimate even if methods were indefensible. That evidence was overwhelming, but that moral complexity made simple guilty verdicts seem inadequate for capturing reality. That justice system's failures had created situation where desperate man had employed terrorism that officials' misconduct had provoked. Judge sentenced Arnett to death by electrocution, Kentucky's capital punishment for multiple premeditated murders. Sentence was mandatory given jury's findings, even though circumstances were extraordinary, and even though many observers believed that officials whose corruption had motivated Arnett's campaign bore responsibility exceeding what law could acknowledge when legal frameworks treated his systematic eliminations as crimes, while immunizing prosecutors and deputies' misconduct from equivalent. Accountability. Arnett's execution was scheduled for November 1974, but attracted national attention from civil rights organizations, highlighting how law enforcement accountability failures created desperate responses. Petitions seeking clemency gathered over 300,000 signatures, arguing that executing man who'd responded to being falsely convicted for crime that deputies had committed represented compounding injustice rather than delivering appropriate punishment. Kentucky Governor Wendell Ford reviewed clemency petition in October 1974, commuted sentence to life imprisonment without parole citing extraordinary circumstances, while maintaining that systematic killing of 14 people couldn't be excused regardless of corruption that had motivated campaign or justice system failures that had created situation where convicted man had felt compelled to deliver accountability through violence that legal channels had refused to provide. Ford's commutation reflected political calculation, balancing law enforcement opposition to clemency against public sympathy for Arnett, whose campaign had exposed real corruption even though methods were indefensible. Arnett served 31 years in Kentucky State Penitentiary before dying in 2005 at age 79 from complications of black lung disease that decades of coal mining had caused, condition that inadequate prison medical care had allowed to deteriorate into fatal respiratory failure, that hospice care during final months had been unable to reverse. He was buried in family cemetery on mountain property, where 5 generations of Booths had been interred, funeral attended by approximately 800 community members, including many who'd supported his campaign against corrupt officials and who viewed his systematic eliminations as justified response to justice system failures that had destroyed innocent lives while protecting guilty officials. During 31 years of imprisonment, Arnett became symbol for movements advocating law enforcement accountability and prosecutorial reform. His case was cited extensively by civil rights organizations, highlighting how qualified immunity and prosecutorial discretion created environments where officers could kill suspects without consequences and where prosecutors could fabricate charges against witnesses who exposed misconduct, patterns that continued affecting communities throughout America, despite increased attention to police brutality following urban riots of 1960s and despite reforms that had been implemented nominally but that remained largely ineffective due to institutional resistance and to legal doctrines protecting officials from accountability. Betty Sue Crawford's 4 children, who'd lost mother to deputies' excessive force and who'd witnessed justice system protect killer while prosecuting witness, suffered lasting trauma from losing parent and from understanding that legal institutions had valued protecting law enforcement over delivering justice for working-class women whose death authorities had characterized as unfortunate accident rather than as homicide deserving prosecution. Eldest daughter Martha, who was 14 when mother died, became advocate for families affected by law enforcement violence, organized support groups for children who'd lost parents to police brutality, worked with civil rights lawyers attempting to hold officers accountable through civil lawsuits. When criminal prosecutions were declined by prosecutors whose relationships with law enforcement created conflicts, preventing objective evaluation of cases. The 21st century brought renewed attention to Arnett Booth case, when historian Patricia Morrison published comprehensive examination of 1973 events, book titled Appalachian Vengeance, Arnett Booth's War Against Law Enforcement Corruption, documenting Betty Sue Crawford's death through medical records, witness testimony, coroner's autopsy showing asphyxiation from chest compression, deputies' fabricated reports shifting blame from Webb to Arnett, prosecutor's decision to charge witness rather than killer, trial featuring perjured testimony, Arnett's systematic elimination campaign, confession, and trial and imprisonment. Morrison's research discovered details that decades had obscured, found that Crawford hadn't been Webb's only victim, when at least 2 of deputies' 3 previous use-of-force incidents had involved suspects suffering injuries requiring hospitalization, pattern suggesting systematic excessive force rather than isolated accident. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that Prosecutor Harrison had received explicit instructions from County Sheriff to charge Arnett with felony murder rather than to investigate Webb's conduct. Internal memoranda showed that Sheriff had argued that prosecuting deputy would undermine law enforcement morale and would expose county to civil liability for Crawford's death, whereas charging Arnett would shift blame and would send message that interfering with arrests carried severe consequences, regardless of whether deputies were employing excessive force. Memoranda proved that Harrison's decision hadn't been independent prosecutorial judgment, but had been coordinated with law enforcement leadership whose interests in protecting Webb from accountability had overridden obligations to pursue justice for Crawford's death. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2018, film titled The Arnett Booth Campaign. When Justice System Failures Create Desperate Violence, featuring interviews with historians, law enforcement accountability advocates, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Arnett and Betty Sue expressing perspectives on whether systematic elimination of 14 officials had been justified response to corruption or whether violence had exceeded what circumstances warranted, even when acknowledging that justice system had completely failed. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both horrific injustice of Crawford's death and of Arnett's false conviction, while also recognizing that killing 14 people created its own victims, whose families had suffered losses regardless of deceased officials' participation in corruption. Most powerful segment featured interview with Jennifer Carter, age 46 in 2018, and granddaughter of Betty Sue Crawford, describing how learning about grandmother's death and about justice system's refusal to prosecute deputy who'd killed her had motivated advocacy for police accountability and for reforming qualified immunity doctrine that protected officers from civil liability even when their actions caused deaths. Jennifer explained that, discovering that grandmother Betty Sue had been asphyxiated by deputies' knee-compressing chest during arrest for shoplifting she hadn't committed, and that prosecutor had charged witness who'd tried to help her rather than charging deputy who'd killed her, helped me understand that accountability failures aren't just historical problems, but continue affecting families today, when officers use excessive force, knowing that qualified immunity and prosecutorial discretion will likely protect them from consequences. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered personnel files showing that Deputy Marcus Webb had received disciplinary warnings in 1971 and 1972 for using excessive force during arrests, that supervisors had recommended remedial training about proper restraint techniques, and had warned that Webb's pattern created liability risks for county, that recommendations had been ignored by sheriff, who'd characterized warnings as interference with deputies' operational discretion, and who'd argued that second-guessing force decisions would undermine officers' authority and would embolden suspects to resist arrests. Files proved that Webb's killing of Crawford hadn't been an unpredictable accident, but had been foreseeable result of known excessive force pattern that proper supervision and discipline would have addressed before fatal incident occurred. Discovery of personnel files documenting ignored warnings about Webb's excessive force generated calls for posthumous investigation of sheriff's conduct. Kentucky Attorney General conducted review in 2019, examining whether officials had violated duties to protect public when allowing known dangerous deputy to continue operating without remedial training or discipline that warnings had recommended. Review concluded that, while direct evidence of criminal negligence is difficult to establish posthumously, pattern of ignored warnings, documented excessive force incidents, and sheriff's refusal to implement recommended reforms creates clear appearance that county law enforcement leadership prioritized protecting deputies from accountability over protecting public from officers whose patterns suggested high risk of causing serious injuries or deaths. Kentucky established Comprehensive Memorial and Educational Center in 2020. At former Perry County Courthouse, where Arnett's trial had occurred, museum documenting case through multiple perspectives, including Betty Sue Crawford's death from chest compression during arrest, medical evidence showing asphyxiation, Arnett's intervention attempting to prevent excessive force, deputies' fabricated reports shifting blame, prosecutors' coordination with sheriff to charge witness rather than killer, trial featuring perjured testimony, systematic elimination campaign, killing 14 officials, confession explaining motives, imprisonment and death. Museum presented balanced historical account, refusing to characterize Arnett as unambiguous hero or as terrorist whose violence exceeded justification. Central exhibit featured side-by-side displays contrasting Crawford's documented innocence and death from excessive force with justice system's failures to hold Webb accountable and fabrication of charges against Arnett. Visitors could read medical evidence showing asphyxiation from chest compression, witness testimony describing Crawford's compliance before force was employed, personnel files documenting warnings about Webb's excessive force pattern, memoranda proving Harrison coordinated with sheriff to charge Arnett rather than investigating Webb. Then could view ethical guidelines about prosecutorial obligations and law enforcement accountability. Exhibit included audio presentations featuring accountability advocates arguing that Arnett's violence was understandable, desperate response to complete system failure, while law enforcement representatives maintained that systematic killing of 14 people couldn't be condoned regardless of corruption-motivating campaign. Memorial Room honored Betty Sue Crawford and listed 2 additional suspects who'd been injured during Webb's previous excessive force incidents that personnel files had documented, acknowledged that multiple people had suffered from deputies' pattern that supervisors had known about, but had failed to address through discipline or training that recommendations had specified. Memorial included audio recording from Jennifer Carter, describing how discovering family history had motivated her advocacy work, attempting to prevent similar tragedies through reforming qualified immunity and through establishing independent oversight of law enforcement that county systems had lacked during 1970s, when sheriffs operated with minimal external accountability. Museum's final exhibit examined question that Arnett's case raised about appropriate responses when justice systems protect officials who kill citizens while prosecuting witnesses who expose misconduct. Memorial Wall posed question, what should citizens do when authorities refuse to hold law enforcement accountable for killing innocent people, and when legal systems prosecute those who attempt to? prevent excessive force. Alongside competing responses from legal scholars, ethicists, civil rights advocates, whose perspectives ranged from arguing that violence is never justified to maintaining that when institutions completely fail, then desperate measures become understandable, even though legal systems cannot sanction systematic killing. By 2024, Arnett Booth's case remained most studied example in prosecutorial ethics courses, examining how coordination between prosecutors and law enforcement to protect officers from accountability while fabricating charges against witnesses corrupts fundamental justice system obligations. Case studied in law enforcement training about excessive force consequences and about importance of addressing warnings before patterns escalate to fatalities. Discussed in qualified immunity debates as illustration of how legal doctrines preventing accountability can motivate desperate private violence when official channels systematically refuse to provide justice. Kentucky legislature passed resolution in 2021, formally acknowledging that Deputy Marcus Webb's 1973 killing of Betty Sue Crawford through chest compression during arrest for shoplifting she hadn't committed represented serious use of excessive force that should have resulted in criminal prosecution. That prosecutor David Harrison's decision to charge witness Arnett Booth with felony murder, rather than investigating Webb's conduct, violated fundamental prosecutorial obligations to pursue justice regardless of law enforcement relationships. That sheriff's coordination with prosecutor to shift blame from deputy to witness demonstrated corruption that destroyed innocent lives while protecting guilty officials. That supervisors' failures to address Webb's documented excessive force pattern after receiving warnings created foreseeable risk that eventually materialized in Crawford's death. Resolution was carefully worded to acknowledge system failures and official corruption, without explicitly justifying Arnett's violence, reflected legislature's recognition that 51 years hadn't resolved questions about when institutional failures justified desperate responses, even though legal systems cannot sanction systematic killing regardless of provocations. Modern law enforcement accountability advocates invoke Arnett's case as historical example, demonstrating importance of independent prosecution of officers who cause deaths, of addressing excessive force patterns before they escalate to fatalities, of protecting witnesses who expose misconduct rather than prosecuting them for interfering with arrests that involve illegal force. Historical marker at Arnett's grave was installed in 2021, inscription reading, Arnett Booth, 1926-2005, systematically killed 14 Perry County officials who participated in covering up Deputy Marcus Webb's responsibility for Betty Sue Crawford's death, and who prosecuted Arnett for felony murder based on fabricated evidence after he'd attempted to prevent Crawford's asphyxiation during excessive restraint. Medical evidence showed Crawford died from chest compression by Webb's knee. Personnel files later revealed Webb had received warnings about excessive force pattern that supervisors had failed to address. Prosecutor coordinated with sheriff to charge Arnett rather than investigating Webb. Trial featured perjured testimony from deputies who'd altered reports. Arnett served 31 years before dying from black lung disease. His case prompted reforms, including independent investigation of law enforcement deaths and protection for witnesses who report excessive force. This grave reminds us that accountability failures and corruption create desperate responses. That protecting law enforcement from consequences when they kill citizens while prosecuting those who expose misconduct destroys justice system's legitimacy, and that systematic violence affects everyone when institutions prioritize protecting officials over serving public. The broader implications of Arnett Booth's case extended far beyond Perry County, when federal investigation prompted by documentary revelations examined whether systematic patterns of prosecutorial coordination with law enforcement to protect officers from accountability existed throughout Kentucky during 1970s. Investigators discovered that Harrison's memoranda, coordinating with sheriff to charge Arnett rather than investigating Webb, weren't isolated incident, but represented common practice where prosecutors routinely declined to charge officers who caused deaths during arrests while pursuing charges against witnesses or bystanders whose interventions or testimony might expose excessive force. Federal review of 37 law enforcement deaths in Kentucky between 1970 and 1975 found that prosecutors had declined charges in 34 cases, while pursuing charges against civilians in 9 cases where witnesses or family members had attempted to intervene or had challenged official accounts of events. Pattern suggested systematic bias protecting law enforcement over accountability obligations. Most disturbing finding was discovery that prosecutors had coordinated explicitly with sheriffs in at least 12 of 37 cases reviewed. Internal communications showed prosecutors seeking guidance from law enforcement leadership about whether charges should be filed when officers caused deaths. Arrangements that created obvious conflicts of interest, preventing objective evaluation of cases when prosecutors' decisions were influenced by officials whose personnel and departments would be affected by charging officers with crimes. The practice violated ethical guidelines, requiring prosecutors to exercise independent judgment based on evidence rather than on political relationships or institutional pressures, but appeared to be widespread throughout Kentucky and likely throughout other states, where similar coordination occurred informally, even when not documented through written communications that federal investigators had uncovered. Federal report issued in 2020 recommended comprehensive reforms, including requiring independent special prosecutors for cases involving law enforcement deaths, establishing protocols preventing prosecutors from coordinating with sheriffs when evaluating whether charges should be filed against deputies, implementing federal oversight when states failed to address patterns of declining prosecutions in officer-involved deaths, creating witness protection provisions, preventing charges against civilians who intervene, attempting to prevent excessive force or who provide testimony challenging official accounts. Recommendations represented significant expansion of federal involvement in state criminal justice systems. Proposals generated opposition from states' rights advocates and from law enforcement organizations, arguing that federal interference would undermine local autonomy and would complicate prosecution of legitimate crimes when witnesses' interventions created dangerous situations requiring use of force. Contemporary legal scholars examining Arnett's case emphasize connections between 1970s accountability failures in Kentucky and modern cases where civilians who film police using excessive force face charges for interfering with law enforcement, even when recordings document misconduct that officers attempted to conceal. Point to ways that criminalizing civilian oversight continues, despite widespread availability of smartphones and body cameras that theoretically should make documenting and exposing misconduct easier than during era when Arnett's intervention had relied on witness testimony that courts had discounted in favor of deputies' fabricated accounts. Persistence of charging witnesses who document or challenge excessive force suggests that institutional biases protecting law enforcement from accountability remain deeply embedded, despite reforms nominally designed to increase transparency and oversight. Arnett's 4 children who'd lost father to imprisonment and who'd grown up understanding that justice system had destroyed family to protect corrupt officials became advocates for wrongfully convicted prisoners, worked with Innocence Project and similar organizations, attempting to exonerate defendants whose convictions had been based on fabricated evidence or perjured testimony similar to prosecution that had convicted Arnett of crime he hadn't committed. Eldest son Daniel became criminal defense attorney, specializing in challenging prosecutions involving law enforcement misconduct. Explained that honoring father required defending others, facing circumstances where institutional pressures to protect officers created risks of wrongful convictions when prosecutors prioritized relationships with law enforcement over obligations to pursue justice, regardless of where evidence led. Modern civil rights litigation, examining excessive force cases, frequently cites Arnett's prosecution as example of how felony murder charges can be manipulated to shift blame from officers who caused deaths onto civilians whose interventions attempted to prevent fatalities. Legal strategy that insulates law enforcement from accountability, while creating deterrent preventing future witnesses from intervening when observing excessive force that might result in deaths if unchallenged. Several appellate courts have cited Arnett's case when reversing convictions or when establishing precedents limiting prosecutors' ability to charge civilians with felony murder based on claims that interventions contributed to deaths that officers' excessive force actually caused. Legal developments that Arnett's advocates characterized as vindicating his position that prosecution had been fabrication designed to protect Webb from accountability. Betty Sue Crawford's case also generated renewed attention when 2020 protests following George Floyd's death highlighted how asphyxiation from chest or neck compression during arrests had killed numerous suspects over decades. Medical experts examining Crawford's autopsy and comparing it with Floyd's and with dozens of similar deaths documented pattern where officers employing prone restraint with body weight, compressing chest or neck, caused asphyxiation that official investigations frequently characterized as resulting from suspects' resistance or pre-existing conditions rather than from excessive force that proper training would have taught officers to avoid. The pattern suggested that accountability failures during Crawford's 1973 death had been repeated countless times when officers employed dangerous restraint techniques, knowing that prosecutors would likely decline charges and that departments would characterize deaths as unfortunate accidents rather than as preventable homicides resulting from inadequate training or from deliberate excessive force. Comparative analysis of Arnett's 14 victims revealed complex picture of institutional corruption, where some officials bore direct responsibility for Crawford's death and cover-up, while others had participated peripherally through providing supporting testimony or through processing paperwork, without necessarily understanding full scope of fabrication that primary conspirators had organized. Of 14 people Arnett had killed, 3 had been directly responsible for Crawford's death and for prosecuting Arnett. Webb, who'd asphyxiated Crawford; Harrison, who'd coordinated with Sheriff to charge Arnett rather than investigating Webb; Judge Bradford, who'd allowed perjured testimony during trial. Additional 11 victims had included deputies who'd provided supporting testimony that investigations suggested had been influenced by pressure from supervisors rather than representing independent recollections of events. County clerk and coroner, whose alterations of documents had facilitated cover-up, but who investigations suggested had been following instructions from officials whose authority they hadn't felt able to challenge. This complexity generated debates among Arnett's supporters about whether systematic elimination of all 14 had been justified when some victims appeared to have borne limited personal responsibility for corruption that primary conspirators had organized, whether distinguishing between leaders and followers who'd participated under institutional pressures should have affected targeting decisions, whether killing people whose culpability varied significantly represented excessive response even when acknowledging that corruption had been systematic and that legal system had completely failed to provide accountability. Arnett's written confession hadn't addressed these distinctions, had characterized all 14 as participants in conspiracy without differentiating degrees of responsibility, suggested that he'd viewed anyone who'd contributed to cover-up as equally guilty, regardless of their positions or their degrees of agency in organizing fabrication. Modern prosecutors examining Arnett's case as cautionary tale about coordination with law enforcement emphasize importance of maintaining independence when evaluating cases involving officers who cause deaths, recognize that institutional pressures and professional relationships create subtle biases that can corrupt decision-making even when prosecutors believe they're exercising objective judgment based solely on evidence. Training programs developed following federal report's recommendations include scenarios based on Arnett's case, requiring prosecutors to identify when coordination with law enforcement crosses from appropriate consultation into problematic coordination that compromises independence, exercises designed to recognize conflicts of interest that Harrison's memoranda had exemplified, when prosecutor had sought sheriff's guidance about whether to charge deputy rather than making determination based exclusively on evidence and applicable law. Law enforcement training examining excessive force consequences similarly uses Crawford's death as example of how failure to address documented patterns can escalate to fatalities that might have been prevented through proper supervision and discipline. Personnel files showing warnings about Webb's previous incidents provide case study demonstrating importance of taking remedial action when patterns emerge rather than dismissing warnings as interference with operational discretion that supervisors had characterized them as when refusing to implement recommended reforms. Training emphasizes that accountability through disciplinary measures and remedial training serves protective function for both public and officers by addressing problematic patterns before they escalate to incidents causing deaths and criminal prosecutions that could have been avoided through earlier intervention. By 2024, Arnett Booth's systematic elimination campaign remained controversial within communities divided between those who viewed his violence as justified response to complete institutional failure and those who maintained that killing 14 people exceeded what any circumstances could justify regardless of corruption or accountability failures motivating campaign. Annual memorial services held at Arnett's grave attracted both supporters celebrating his resistance to corruption and critics condemning systematic violence regardless of provocations. Gatherings demonstrated that 51 years hadn't resolved fundamental disagreements about limits of justified violence when legal systems fail, and about whether desperate measures become morally permissible when institutions demonstrate complete unwillingness to provide accountability through official channels. Descendants of Arnett's 14 victims expressed diverse perspectives, ranging from continued anger at killings that had destroyed families to acknowledgement that deceased officials had participated in corruption deserving consequences, even though systematic elimination had exceeded appropriate response. Several families had participated in reconciliation efforts, including supporting Memorial's balanced presentation, acknowledging both Crawford's death and justice system failures, while also honoring Arnett's victims, whose families had suffered regardless of deceased officials' degrees of culpability. Other families had refused participation, maintained that Memorial legitimized terrorism, and dishonored victims by suggesting their deaths had been justified consequences of institutional failures, when actually they'd been murders deserving unqualified condemnation rather than contextual explanation that seemed to excuse violence. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of law enforcement accountability and desperate justice across 51 years, the discovery that Betty Sue Crawford died from deputies' chest compression during arrest for shoplifting she hadn't committed, the prosecutor's coordination with sheriff to charge witness rather than investigating deputy who'd caused death, the trial featuring perjured testimony from deputies who'd fabricated reports, the systematic elimination of 14 officials, including some whose participation in cover-up appeared to have been coerced through institutional pressures rather than representing independent criminal choices, the impossible questions about whether killing 14 people could ever be justified when responding to false murder conviction based on fabrication, and whether victims whose degrees of responsibility varied significantly should have been distinguished rather than being targeted equally. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how accountability failures and prosecutorial corruption create desperate responses, how coordination between prosecutors and law enforcement to protect officers while fabricating charges against witnesses destroys justice systems' legitimacy, how maternal and familial grief motivates resistance that courts condemn, but that institutional failures sometimes provoke when alternatives are systematically denied. Comment about whether Arnett's systematic campaign was proportional response to being falsely convicted for crime that deputy committed, or whether alternatives existed he should have pursued, whether 51 years is sufficient time to judge whether violence was justified when contemporary cases still involve prosecutors declining charges against officers who caused deaths while pursuing charges against witnesses who document misconduct, whether Memorial should emphasize Arnett's desperation and corruption, exposing or focus on 14 deaths and their families' losses. Because these questions persist wherever law enforcement accountability fails, wherever prosecutors coordinate with police to protect officers from consequences when they kill citizens, wherever witnesses who expose or attempt to prevent excessive force face prosecution designed to deter future oversight, wherever families must decide between accepting that institutions won't deliver justice when officials cause deaths and employing private violence that legal systems cannot sanction, but that moral desperation sometimes motivates when official channels have been exhausted, and when corruption demonstrates complete unwillingness to hold authorities accountable for killing innocent people. Until next time, Remember that Arnett Booth killed 14 Perry County officials, defending himself against false murder conviction that prosecutor coordinated with sheriff to fabricate after Deputy Webb had asphyxiated Betty Sue Crawford during excessive restraint for shoplifting she hadn't committed. That medical evidence proved Crawford died from chest compression by Webb's knee. That personnel files later revealed Webb had received warnings about excessive force pattern that supervisors failed to address. That prosecutors' memoranda proved coordination with law enforcement to charge witness rather than investigating deputy. That trial featured perjured testimony from deputies who'd altered reports shifting blame from Webb to Arnett. That systematic elimination campaign killed 14 people, including some whose participation in cover-up appeared coerced through institutional pressures. That federal investigation revealed prosecutors throughout Kentucky routinely coordinated with sheriffs to protect officers from accountability while charging witnesses who exposed misconduct. That reforms prompted by case-established independent prosecution protocols and witness protections. That memorial honors Crawford while acknowledging Arnett's victims and institutional failures, and that ultimately prosecutorial corruption, coordinating with law enforcement to fabricate charges protecting officers who kill citizens, creates tragedies affecting multiple generations. When accountability mechanisms fail, and when desperate responses become necessary for exposing institutional failures, that official oversight systematically refuses to address despite evidence documenting systematic patterns of protecting guilty officials while destroying innocent lives through criminal prosecutions, serving law enforcement interests rather than justice. The enduring legacy of Arnett Booth's 1973 campaign continues shaping debates about appropriate responses to institutional corruption, about limits of prosecutorial discretion when relationships with law enforcement create conflicts, preventing objective evaluation of cases, about whether systematic violence can ever be justified when responding to complete accountability failures, about how societies should memorialize complex historical events where legitimate grievances motivated indefensible methods and where victims included both innocent civilians killed by law enforcement and officials whose degrees of culpability varied significantly. These questions remain unresolved 51 years after Betty Sue Crawford's death, and Arnett's systematic response persist wherever law enforcement accountability failures continue affecting communities, wherever prosecutors coordinate with police rather than maintaining independence that justice requires, wherever witnesses documenting or challenging excessive force face retaliation through criminal charges designed to deter oversight, that institutional reforms nominally encourage, but that practical realities systematically punish when protecting law enforcement from accountability, remains higher priority than protecting public from officers whose misconduct patterns suggest high risks of causing serious injuries or deaths, that proper supervision and discipline would prevent before escalating to tragedies destroying innocent lives.